Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Today, I wanted to take a look at the roundtable that Max had between Maevy, Driney, and Growl, and talk about some of the things I liked. There was a lot from the video I agreed with, and I'm not going to rehash the entire thing that I agreed with, but I wanted to talk about some of the areas where I disagreed with the group, and some of my thoughts for where the Evoker spec could kind of be leaning towards, both for raids and for a Mythic Plus environment. A couple of the things that they focused on very early on, we're talking about how this 25-yard range would interact with, different raid instances. And so one of the first things that they talked about that I wanted to focus on was very early on in the video, where they talked about how the spec could operate based off of something like Fetid Devourer, which is a fight back in the beginning of BFA, which I want to say, here we go. You'd have the boss running around, and you'd start fighting the different eggs and corners to prevent the boss from eating them. So it was a very spread fight. And so I wanted to talk about what they were relating to begin with.
25-yard range. And also it's sort of the play style of you just have like these pretty good buttons that you're mostly just like pressing them when they light up, sort of like how Shaman just like press
A little bit
It's
early.
like the exact same healing profile that a Shaman has, but it's very similar to like a hybridization between Shaman Mistweaver or Shaman Disc. It like fits in between those classes depending on what side of the healer talent, like the actual spec specific talent tree you fall into.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like it's a lot like Shaman too, in the way that, number one, it feels like some fights it could be really, really good, some fights it's bad because its utility is so specific. Like, it's APT and Spirit Link are like insane for certain situations. And there's other times where if it was like a fight you had to spread, like I just try and imagine playing this class on like Fetid Devourer or something. It just would literally do absolutely nothing with 25-yard range. And also it's sort of the play style of you just have like these pretty good buttons that you're mostly just like pressing them when they light up, sort of like how Shaman just like presses Wellspring, presses Unleash Life. You just like have these like efficient buttons that you're just kind of sending off CD.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to talk about is that first point, where there is one build that plays very similar to how Growl is talking about, where you're pretty much just sending abilities on cooldown all the time. And that build is right around here, I believe. Yes. And it's one which has a lot of interaction with Emerald Blossom. Emerald Blossom is one of the baseline essence abilities for Evoker, which allows you to place down what's basically like an efflorescence, but it pops, it explodes. And there's a lot of interaction with it, where Fluttering Seedlings gives you more seedlings that burst out, do healing. You have others which will have these seedlings grow into new blossoms themselves, and they can chain into each other. You could also spec into Cycle of Life, which is a bit awkward with how the tree works, but it leaves behind mini Cloudburst totems, as Maevy had mentioned as well in the video. Like I said, not all these ideas are mine by any means. Go watch the video if you want the full revamp of it. I just want to focus on some of the things I sort of disagree with and some that I really think are important to drill down upon. So this build absolutely is a very big thing, and it's a very important thing, but it's not the only way that the spec works at the moment. And I do want to focus kind of on how, if this is the only build that really comes out, it's also not the biggest of deals as Maevy and Driney start highlighting right after.
There's currently a playstyle that you could play truly mid-range, where like you're not required to be in a stack point of like being melee or range, but like let's say something like Sludge Fist, where like you would be in between the melee and range, where like ranged one to be really far away, melee obviously you have to be on the boss, you would be in between and you'd still be able to heal everyone pretty easily. And that's like the disc-ish style of gameplay loop that it has available to it currently, which might be a bugged interaction, might not be. We'll have to see how they feel about it, but it essentially just kind of ramps similarly to a Disc Priest and has like a chain heal kind of healing delivery system for that healing.
Yeah, I also think that, like, on Growl's point as well, about like how on Fetid Devourer they would be basically worthless. There's been a lot of cases actually on fights where...
Actually, before we get into the rest of that point that he's going to make, I wanted to talk about the build that Maevy is bringing up right now. He talks about it in further length a little bit further down into the video, and it's right around here, and we're also going to show you guys a diagram right after he describes it.
Stacked up when you cast an empowered spell, so it's like...
Okay.
The talent below that is Spirit Bloom. This is essentially Empower Chain Heal, if you can think about it like that, where
Okay.
basically the longer you empower it, the more allies it heals, it acts as Chain Heal. If you echo a Spirit Bloom, each person that you echoed, so it will replicate the full effect. So if you hold down a rank 3 Spirit Bloom, it heals 3 people. If you have an echo out, that echo will also heal 3 people. This is the only spell that works in that way in terms of multiplying AoE heals.
So just to be able to get a better visualization of what he's actually talking about, my buddy Rizzo from stream made this awesome graphic. If you take the Empower talents later on down the line, you'll be able to hit a total of 4 targets instead of just 3. So if you're standing in the middle, they were talking about it before in a fight like Sludge Fist, where you would be able to cast Echo on Steve in the top right and Bob in the bottom left, and then be able to cast Spirit Bloom, like this chain heal effect, and heal Mary and 3 targets around her. But the Echo effect will also cast Spirit Bloom on Steve, and it'll also cast Spirit Bloom on Bob as well, allowing for these 4 target hits to become another 4 target hit and another 4 target hit. So there is a potential for an Echo build to really work out well if that is actually intended. As Maevy noted, we don't really know if that's supposed to be how it works, because other abilities that you are going to be echoing, like for example, if you echo a Dream Breath, well, the Dream Breath will hit 4 or 5 targets, something along those lines. It's just like you get a +1 hit out of the Dream Breath. It doesn't cast the entire breath again onto other people. You'd need to stasis that first to be able to have that sort of access. So this sort of ability could be incredibly powerful for something like Fetid Devourer, where people are going to be spread all over the place. They also talk in a moment about Jailer, and I think it is around that 10-minute mark that we skipped between. So I do think there's some potential, as long as the build doesn't get fixed.
Fights where healers don't have to all like kind of do the same.
Oh, sorry, and the point Max is going to be making is, even if this build is going to get wrecked, it's not the end of the world for the Evokers.
There's been a lot of cases actually on fights where healers don't have to all like kind of do the same thing. Like, for example, if they had a bunch of really powerful, like close group or small target healing, like that's stuff that's happened in the past. Like look at P2 of Jailer, for example, right? Like most groups had, like their Holy Priest, like kind of spot healing the middle group. They had their Disc Priest ramping during like big sets of AoE damage. And then they had like a Resto Druid or a Holy Priest just watching one side of the line people. And then like, at least for our guild, Driney was Rule of Law, like beaconing the other side. So you have like kind of mini assignments like that at all times where, and this is actually commonly done by Paladins now, where like Paladins do a ton of like focused melee healing and tank healing over the whole fight, and they're like kind of obviously near the boss, even though they have a longer range than Evokers do. But like you kind of separate that stuff out to where like a lot of the hot healers or ramp healers are focusing more on ranged on some encounters, to where if something is powerful enough at a niche, it can kind of just do that alone, to where like on Fetid, for example, it could just sit around the boss and mainly focus on melee, and it could still be potentially powerful if other healers were focusing on other things.
We saw a really good example of what Max just talked about in the Mythic Anduin encounter during Progress. There were 5 healers on that fight, and Echo ran with a Mistweaver, and Liquid ran with a Disc Priest. But both specs did basically the same thing. They healed up the barriers, and they healed people upstairs. Now, the Shadow Word Pains that Anduin would apply to our allies on that fight required a lot of spot healing, especially when bursts of damage were going off, or you had to heal the Befouled Barrier and they might be in it. And that was where, Holy Priests or Paladins or whoever would do a better job of that. The Holy Priests and Paladins would be the ones responsible for doing a lot of the healing downstairs, whereas the Disc Priest and Mistweaver were just healing upstairs. So just because there's going to be strengths or weaknesses to specs, even if this Echo build that Maevy had described gets fixed, I do still think that there is quite a lot of hope. But I hope that they don't fix up that Echo build, and I hope that it keeps on going.
Yeah, this healer I would not want to play in Jailer P2. The rest of Jailer,
Yeah.
I think in P2 is
Interesting.
P2
Why is that?
Like in Jailer P2, you know how like you're already really spread, and you have like one healer that watches the right people, one healer that watches the left people, because 40-yard range can't even cover that, right?
Yeah.
Now imagine you're restricted to, basically half that. Like you're in living hell. You have to move like so far to be able to spot heal the people who need critical healing due to their assignment in the fight, which is, the only hard part about that phase was healing bloods necessarily. So needing to have such extreme movement to get to those spots while also needing movement to deal with the mechanics on the fight, I think Evoker would completely just faceplant in that phase. You'd need to be hard carried, but I think you could, you could do a lot better than like what a shaman or like a Mistweaver would bring in like phase 1, 3, and 4 of Jailer. So it's, I think, really good at stacked healing, but when you need to be ultra spread, it completely fails.
So one of the areas where they talk about is Jailer P2, and I pulled up a quick diagram or quick look at what we had for our Jailer P2 this past week, where you do have the entire raid stacked up as teams are going out with the Azurite lines, feeding them into the boss. 100% agree that there is that problem, but if this Echo build, this Echo Spirit Bloom build exists, that could mostly solve the problem. What would need to happen is you'd need to have longer duration on Echo, which you're able to achieve with the Timeless Magic talents, giving you longer Echo duration, which would then allow you to start casting Echoes, on players in the middle lines. And the nice thing about these Azurite lines is you always know how the breakdown's going to look. Fonts, for example, would always be at this position for his Azurite line, whereas Baki would always be in the back. Same thing with Revolt, would be in the back, whereas Zorg or Manwë would be in the middle. So what you could potentially do is you could cast Echoes into middle targets and then cast Spirit Bloom onto your raid group here, which would then reflect that Echo healing onto these targets, assuming Echo's range is going to be long enough for those abilities. I believe that the range might be an issue that they would have to have. I'd have to see if I can play around with it just a little bit more they have. Also, I just saw they revamped the tree so that Echo is first. Kind of interesting. Actually, they repositioned a couple little things, but we'll get to that a little bit later. I do think, however, there is some possibility as long as you're able to reach those targets and as long as Echo's reach is not mitigated too much.
So
yeah, I definitely don't see it as like a single target like spot healer. Like I sort of see it in a way like Paladin is, where you have like this group of melee. Like I almost sort of see it as a melee healer. The only thing I wanted to add too about rescue is that, so when you talk about this idea, right, of, oh, it's 25 yards, so you can kind of sit in between melee and range, using rescue a lot sort of throws that out the window, right? And that's one of the big downsides of rescue, is that if you try and have that play style where you're in the middle, as soon as you rescue to anybody, you're literally out of range of half of them, you know? Like, you can't necessarily just plant, I think, in the middle in the way that people think you can.
Yeah, basically what I was saying for like the middle playthrough is basically you wouldn't use rescue at all for actual healing throughput. There's ways around it right now, which again might be bugged interactions, and we can touch on that once we actually start exploring talents, because it all depends on the talents that you take to do that kind of healing.
okay.
Yeah, and they start talking about movement and going into further depth. And one thing that came from this conversation that I wish they would have talked about a little bit more, or maybe just given it a little bit more credit to, was Astro Strike. They talk about it around 34-minute mark of this ability that can help generate more essence for you. Essence Burst, of course, starts with Living Flame, which will allow your next essence ability to be free. But as you go down the line with the talents, you can have Astro Strike give you a 15% chance to cause that Essence Burst, so you can have more free essence costing abilities. Essence Burst is instant cast, still has the 25-yard range, and costs less mana than Living Flame, and it's only a damage ability. So absolutely, if somebody needs healing, you'd use the Living Flame on them and be sure to benefit from the Essence Burst potential. But as filler, or as you are repositioning yourself, I do think that a lot of credit should be given towards Astro Strike for the potential to help you reposition and increase your movement.
It does more.
Okay.
That's just good. It doesn't really matter, like, out of those three choice notes, because you just want Leaping Flames below it. So whatever path you want to take, you can. This is like a very flex point.
Do healers cast Azure Strike at all?
You can.
So,
I
so it's
mean,
very unlikely to be this. It's probably going to be like a pressing roar in a lot of situations, and then a very teched out situation where you would play Unravel. That's very rare in PvE that you would use this.
So there's a talent on the Preservation tree. I think it's like right smack dab in the middle, the glowy one. And I think what that does is when you use Azure Strike, you have a chance to proc a free essence. Basically, it's like a clear cast. I don't know if it's good. I have no idea, but
It is.
that's there. So it could be a thing where you are
I think it
crushing
is.
Azure Strike as a filler to get procs.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a less % chance than the Living Flame one, and Living Flame provides healing, and
Right. Well, Astro Strike you can use while moving, and it's an instant.
Right.
cast,
Yeah.
right?
So I mean, but like hitting one additional enemy doesn't really increase the chance of that proc happening because the proc is based on the cast, not the number of enemies hit. So
Correct.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah,
I guess
so-
it doesn't
so
really
let's-
make a point.
So let's just do a press.
So what they were talking about there is being able to use Astro Strike in downtime should be a big consideration for how you can reposition yourself and how you can set yourself up for more healing output. Whether you're going to use your Essence Burst for an Emerald Blossom spam button seed build like Growl talked about at the beginning of our video, or whether you're going to use it like Maevy mentioned for putting out more echoes and being able to set up powerful chain heals and spirit blooms that are reflecting onto a variety of targets, you are going to be in a situation where you're pretty consistently essence starved and you need to reposition a lot, and Azure Strike solves most of those problems. We're going to talk a little bit more about movement, as they mentioned a little bit later on in their VOD.
which could see some use. I don't really know how valuable that is. But
This is what they're talking about
I don't know.
exuberance.
most of the-
could see some use, and
Shield
also
Booth,
which will certainly come into play in Mythic Plus.
There we go.
and
Down
fly
here.
with me shield as well.
Yeah, and fly with me.
And
shield.
also, technically, the movement speed buff below the stamina node, which could see some use. I don't really know how valuable that is, but like,
If you're spamming Azure Strike, being 10% faster all the time, very good.
I don't know.
That's most
could
of the
be
fight. You
some
would just be
tech.
10% faster. Yeah,
Yeah.
it could be like
Okay.
a boss where you're constantly dodging things, like say Painsmith. Having a baseline 10% movement speed would just like, you know, if you pulled that boss 200 times, you might have like 10 or 15 less deaths because you just happen to be 10% faster.
Yeah, and if you want more damage, you could take Quell and the 2 points below Quell to help increase your like Fire Breath damage conversion into healing, as well as just doing more damage. Like that's an option. You can spend those last 3 points in that as well.
So there's a lot of different options like they were talking about. And like I said, I didn't want to go over every little thing in the video, but some of the big things that I felt were most important to Merit. One of the things we talked about when it comes to downtime is using Azure Strike to be able to build up your essence so that you could spend it on Echo or Emerald Blossom or whatever it is that you need. One of the things, however, is the different abilities, whether it's Echo or Emerald Blossom, whatever, they're gated by essence, but they're also gated by mana. And we haven't really seen enough conversation about how you're going to be able to deal with mana. And this is where, in the VOD, they start talking about Disintegrate and how it's pretty garbage. One of the big changes I would like to see is because I agree with them that Disintegrate is pretty garbage. It's just a channeled sort of mind flay that costs essence. You have to plant your feet. You can't move while you're casting it. And you have to spend a talent at the bottom of the tree, which is incredibly, incredibly competitive with a lot of good options here. And you're not really getting a whole lot for it. So I would like to see a big change to this, if mana's even going to be considered an issue, as all the classes across the board for healers so far have had a number of different ways to be able to regen mana. So I'd like to see it as a way to like actively regen mana, but having it at these bottom trees where it's already so clogged is incredibly challenging. So I don't think that we're going to see much use at all out of Disintegrate, but I wish that we would. As we mentioned previously, I think that this sort of setup with Azure Strike and being able to generate essence is a little bit underutilized. And so I wanted to talk a couple different points about where they bring up how essence starved the spec can be.
I guess it's an easy fix, but it's just a silly bug that's in the game right now.
Okay. So unlikely to take it. All right, Growl, Mythic Plus gang, all gone. What are we doing?
All gone. So I have actually the whole top of the tree. I have all 9 points. I mean, you have to spend 8 of them anyway. I feel like there's no way you don't take time dilation.
Yep.
And then also,
Time
the
dilation's
one
nuts.
difference is that one below time dilation, the one that buffs it. I think that's definitely worth taking. The delays 70% of damage. It's, I guess, a flex. You don't necessarily have to, but I think that spell seems really, really good.
Okay.
I would definitely take, sorry, I'm trying to see all the names. I think you'd probably still take one of the ones on the left side below Spirit Bloom. I'm not sure yet. That's one that I have to play around and kind of feel. I feel like you're probably not pressing Spirit Bloom too often, so I'd probably...
Sorry, real quick. This is a different part of the VOD than I intended, but this is where he's talking about keys, and I want to talk about this too.
CDR on it is going to be that good. You probably take the one that gives you essence regen. Another thing I want to point out, all the way in the top left, it's not a talent change, but so Dream Breath, if you look at the way it scales, it reduces the cooldown a lot, but it doesn't actually scale the healing that much. And one thing that's actually interesting in
This is a
Mythic
really
Plus
good
is
point.
it might actually be correct to be using just rank 1 Dream Breath and just rip it, because channeling it longer doesn't really give you that much benefit if you don't need to press it on cooldown, right? Like in a raid, you're pressing it over and over again for throughput and to build your empowers. But in Mythic Plus, it might be just be a thing where you just like charge it to 1 and then use it and just not use it as often.
Okay.
Which I think is like kind of cool difference in gameplay. Again, it's not something you change talent-wise.
I want to say, outside of maybe one ability being Spirit Bloom, I think that every empower ability that currently exists for Evoker seems under-realized and could be much more creative and good.
Yeah. One of the big things I really agree with there is not being able to cast empower abilities on the move feels horrific. And it gets talked about in the VOD at like 6 different points by everybody, pretty much. That would probably be one of the biggest things, is having the ability Hover, which should be over on the class tree somewhere. On this one. Being able to cast different abilities on the move. I guess it is baseline. Basically, being able to cast spells on the move is super, super valuable, but not being able to cast empowered abilities on the move feels really bad. They continue on throughout this tree and start talking about having a sort of like Blossom build, which was a little bit strange to me, instead of having one that's built more off the back of Echo for a Mythic Plus environment. And so while I agree that in like a 5-man environment, or sorry, in a raid environment, Blossom is just super powerful and has tons of interactions, this one was a little bit strange to me, especially when Maevy does talk about Reversion's interaction, or hot interaction, with something like Grace Period, which could be really, really valuable as well.
Depending on how many reversions you can have out at a time, it seems weak, but
Yeah.
It's a pretty solid.
yeah, it's pretty solid. But also, I want to see all these 3-point nodes turn into 2-point nodes at the same value.
Yeah. Sorry, it was a little bit.
I think. And it's also,
I just don't
another
see how,
reason
like-
is it's like a very bronzy type thing, and it's clearly talking about and including the like bronze things that are directly in this line. But you are right that it's like the
Right. Then the capstone is green, so it confuses me because of that. But
Yeah, okay.
I mean, maybe there's a different way you can set this up where maybe stasis gets moved to cycle and cycle gets moved to stasis.
Yeah,
but
the
then that locks out
capstones need a lot of
possibilities.
work.
I don't know. So we're gonna go stasis. So we're taking Grace Period, which says 15% increased healing on targets with reversion. So basically, your Riptide just boosts your other healing on your target by 15%.
that seems kind of weak.
It's honestly kind of good, because if you were to echo like a reversion on like a tank, you get a 30% boost to the tank.
And that could just be insane output, especially if you're going to be able to build up multiple essence bursts and multiple echo casts that you can put onto a variety of targets, so not only your tank is receiving increased healing, but everybody in your 5-man party could be receiving at least a 15% healing buff, and then you could shade it into Spirit Bloom, into Dream Breath, into really whatever that you have access to. I think when we're looking at like this tree, we're missing out on the Echo replicating additional output, because Echo on its own will only replicate 70% of the ordinary output. But if you take the 3-pointer at a Time Lord, it'll become a full 100%, and that could be extraordinarily helpful for just having one, good hot healing onto a variety of targets, but also just making sure that your 5-man healing is going to be that much more efficient through the use of things like Echo. Also, similarly, you could just Echo a Spirit Bloom and then replicate that full heal onto a ton of different targets as well, and that makes things a lot better. There was another thing throughout this VOD where they talk about Sacral Empowerment. And I talked about this in my last talent overview for Evoker, where consuming a full Temporal Compression, this is what you get out of casting bronze spells. It stacks up to 4 times, which is kind of like haste for your empowered abilities. I saw this mentioned a little bit at, I believe, 109, a little bit ahead in the VOD, and talking about utilizing this ability, and I really hate it. I really, really hate it, because I think that it costs a lot, and it takes a lot of, like, time for you to waste. So they talk about its interaction with Exhilarating Burst.
nodes down here into 2-point nodes, you still couldn't get the other capstone, but you could get a lot of the flex points above it, which
Change your gameplay.
Oh, they change your gameplay a whole bunch, because the ones on the right, if you read those, like the one on the far right, or sorry, the far left, I'm stupid, directions are hard. Consuming a full temporal compression gains you Essence Burst. The one next to it says whenever you gain Essence Burst, your crit healing's increased by 50% for 8
That
seconds.
talent is
In game,
broken.
it's only 20. It says 20%, but the buff gives you 50%. So those two combined are incredibly powerful, because you consume a temporal compression by casting a full Empower spell. Then you get an Essence Burst, which increases the crit healing of that
You
Empower
can pretty much
spell.
have that buff up like almost 100% of the time if you really want to like fish for that
Yeah.
proc.
and then you go for the extra Empower stage, which is the true middle of all those 7 points, and you get an extra Empower stage. So now, like, you're really focusing on Empower spells, but you can't do that in this current tree because you just don't have enough points if you want 2 capstones.
So the point he makes about not having enough points is very true, but there's also other limitations that they talk about a little bit further in the VOD, and one of those is just not having enough bronze spells to be able to cast.
Pretty much only temporal compress 1 out of your 3.
Feel
Four-
horrific.
Imagine 4 3-second casts every 15 seconds. Like, that's like,
with
what?
the Echo build, you temporal compress them down to like 2.5 second casts. So it's not as bad, but it's still like you pretty much only temporal compress 1 out of your 3 because you just don't have enough essence to spend enough echoes to get enough temporal compressions to get the cast time down.
Yeah, I love the class.
So that's part of the problem, like he just said. I know he said it very, very quickly, and I'll go back one more time.
The best way to get HPS is to spam these empowered spells for every...
Temporal compress them down to like 2.5 second casts. So it's not as bad, but it's still like you pretty much only temporal compress 1 out of your 3 because you just don't have enough essence to spend enough echoes to get enough temporal compressions to get the cast time down.
So, and just to revamp that one more time, only bronze spells will reduce the cast time of your Empower abilities, and you don't have a lot of bronze spells. You have Echo, which cost essence, which means that you would need to be spamming Astro Strike or Living Flame or something to build up Essence Burst to cast a lot of them, because you'd have to cast 4 of these bronze abilities, so it would have to be some Echoes, some Reversions. You can't really rely on casting your raid cooldowns to be able to work with it. And so, if you're trying to take advantage of this crazy Sacral Empowerment, you need to cast so many different bronze abilities and not cast other empowered abilities until you bring up to 4. But if you're playing with certain builds like Dream Breath and you want to cast it more frequently and you're getting a 15 or 10 second cooldown on it, you can't cast enough of the bronze spells in between the cooldown while also keeping things like Spirit Bloom on cooldown. It's also really important to be casting things like Fire Breath, because Life Giver's Flame in the middle of the tree here will also heal allies and be able to give you some good synergy, and just adding extra damage is going to be increasingly efficient. So there's some problems that you have to deal with there. Personally, I'm of the opinion that things like Sacral Empowerment are very bad, and that I really hope that there is going to be a build that continues to exist where you could split and replicate Spirit Blooms, but I'm not sure how likely it is to be able to continuously see the light of day. They talked about it before, about Zephyr being a crazy raid cooldown, and I wholeheartedly agree. I kind of think of it as like a better Darkness or a better AMZ, where you're able to put your most vulnerable people in the group, make sure that they're going to be able to have their damage reduced, and then you can hold other raid cooldowns or other personal defenses for a later point as well. Maevy brought up a great point about the interaction with your Mastery, where it's based off your health percentage. And so if you're using this defensive and it's going to hit you and all the other vulnerable people, well, the other 15 people that are out there in the raid are going to likely be a lower health percentage than you, allowing your follow-up heal to do even more thanks to that Mastery sort of benefit that you have on hand. So I really like that. Some of the biggest points that I disagreed with them throughout this video was sort of sleeping on Astro Strike as filler during downtime. I do agree with them that Disintegrate at the moment is bad, but I really hope that they move this talent up into another level to be able to help make it a little bit more friendly to a variety of people. I think that is a very big need, and maybe had a good summary as well at the end, talking about how clogged this last tier of points is, because you only have 10 points to be able to suspend. Getting something like Essence Burst for crit healing is fantastic and wonderful. There's also just a lot of straight up good buffs out of allies being healed with Dream Breath, getting a hot component added to it. I do think Timekeeper, as nice and convenient, as fun as it is, probably will not see the light of day for a raiding environment, unfortunately. Because just having one extra charge, you're not too frequently going to be pooling them up the way that you would in like a Mythic Plus environment, which would be really powerful. If you're playing in this right side tree is more focused on an Echo build, if you're playing more of an Echo build, Stasis could be pretty dang good, and you could probably take that instead of Grove Tender if mana isn't going to be as much of a concern, but we don't quite know what our mana situation is going to be looking like until we start going into a raid environment more frequently. Having something like Dream Breath as a way to scale up or down our mana consumption could be fantastic. So we could potentially cast this at like lower ranks and heal slightly less. Or we could just wait for the max rank and just not use the ability robotically on CD if we can't quite afford it mana-wise, and we need the mana to spend on echoes and those sort of pseudo ramps out of Spirit Bloom. We'll have to be able to see on that one. I do think Stasis has some really, really fun interactions that it has, but it's also kind of a long cooldown, it feels like, for what it's really bringing to the table, at least at the moment. Maybe I'm just sleeping on it a little bit too much, but overall I would say the capstones feel a little bit all over the place. Having some buffs towards reversion, time dilation, and echo, which are all bronze abilities, not have a buff with stasis or not lead you into stasis, super strange. Very, very strange. Having a stacking buff for healing out of targets with reversion, this feels amazing in a 5-man environment, but in a raid environment, it kind of makes me want to like shy away from stasis in some regards as well, because you're not going to have that many casts of reversion going out onto a variety of targets, maybe a little bit more once you get some crit. However, I am a very big believer in this Echo Spirit Bloom build, and I hope it stays around, because I think it'll add a lot more complexity and thought to the class, and that's where I think the spec could really be very interesting. If this goes away, and instead of having all these buffs, we instead go down into Emerald Blossom synergy through and through, and it's just constant synergy for Emerald Blossom, then I'd feel a lot worse, and not quite as interested in the spec doing something like this. I feel a little bit worse about it just because you'd be mashing Emerald Blossoms all the time, every single time that you have access to them, and not really putting a lot of thought into how you're building up your healing and generating your healing. You just say, okay, gotta make sure I'm hitting my Blossom at a location that's gonna hit 3 targets, and then we move on. So, we'll have to see what we end up with. I do hope that the Echo build has a lot more synergy and thought that gets put into it. As they mentioned before, trimming down some of these trees so that it's only going to be 2 points at the end would be fantastic. If you're able to hover as you're casting an empowered ability, that would be massive. And I do think hover interaction is very important with hover movement speed, hover duration, as well as movement speed from things like exuberance, or being able to have time spiral to reset the cooldown or allow you to cast another hover as needed can be really, really valuable for a spec that's going to kind of jump and move all over the place. The way I see Evoker right now is a spec that's constantly able to move and reposition itself steadily along the raid and not have to make big jumps with rescue every 5 seconds, but instead to be able to move and adjust their positioning while casting a Astro Strike to build up essence bursts, to be able to spend on Blossom as needed, or on Echo to be able to replicate Spirit Blooms, which is like that chain heal, to be able to do tons of healing. That's what I hope to be able to see. But if you guys have any other thoughts on some of these talents or on the roundtable and everything like that, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I know this one was a little bit longer, but I tried to add a summary of some of the things I liked, didn't like, and everything from the roundtable that they had. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed. I'll catch you all next time. Later.